Hiya there, folks. Welcome to episode 13 of Nintendo Deep Dive. My name is Carl. I am the creator and host of this podcast. To the uninitiated, Nintendo Deep Dive is a retrospective-focused Nintendo show, all about retro Nintendo games and retro Nintendo machines, often, featuring retrospective reviews. Only one thing on the docket for today, and that is my Ogrebattle 64 review, which, as I am writing the script for this review, a game called Unicorn Overlord was announced for Switch, and there are some striking similarities. Though Ogrebattle is a much better name than Unicorn Overlord. It's like they don't even have marketing people. That said, let us dive right into the review. Ogrebattle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber. Fantastic subtitle, might I say first. Ogrebattle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber, released in North America on October 5th, 2000, developed by Quest Corporation, and published and localized by Atlas USA. Names attached were Tetsuya Azayagi as director, Makoto Takagawa as producer, Koji Takino as designer, Masayaki Kitagawa as programmer, and Toshiaki Kato in the artist role, and Tomokazu Momota as the writer, or one of the writers. According to the internet, these developers are primarily associated with the Ogrebattle and Tactics Ogre franchises. The three composers, Hayato Matsuyo, Masaharu Iwata, and Hitoshi Sakamoto, are more prominent, having done music for Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy Tactics, and of course, Ogrebattle and Tactics Ogre, among other things that they've done. So, now that the developers have been given their due, what is Ogrebattle 64? It is a real-time strategy RPG with instances of turn-based combat upon enemy engagement. The setting of the game is a high fantasy world with warring states, mythical beasts, and magic. You play as Magnus Gallant, a military officer of the Palantinian army who, becoming quickly disillusioned by the atrocities of his side and the disparity between nobility and commoners, joins the rebellion he set out to destroy. And those under his immediate command do likewise. There is your context. Before I delve into the nuts and bolts of Ogrebattle 64, I will say that I was both very excited and terrified of this game. Excited because it was a strategy RPG of immense scale, according to a particular podcast, and terrified because of the potential time sink I thought the game was going to be. But definitely more excited than worried for the game. Even thinking it was going to be a dark horse title on the N64. And I pictured myself giving it, that elusive 9 out of 10. Keep in mind, the game was an unknown quantity to me, having seen only 2 or so images. But I understood that your units moved in squads, unlike typical strategy RPGs, and that they moved in real time across a vast map, which to me meant that you could be operating in a larger theater of war than was seen in something like Fire Emblem, which serves as my point of reference for strategy RPGs. Such was my thinking prior to hands-on experience. Booting the game up, I was met with a very lovely title screen, featuring silhouetted warriors on a hillside as heavenly course serenaded me. And that was all very nice. After that, I played through the entire tutorial. Then I skimmed the manual, though this game may have the distinction of being the only game on the N64 that doesn't require reading the manual, with Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time also not requiring it. Actually, there's more games yet, but you should always read the manuals with N64 games regardless. Anyway, all the info on how to play this game is built into the game as game tutorials and text tutorials, all in their own menus, and I must have spent 5 hours engaging with that and another 2 hours just learning the organization screen, all before truly delving into the missions. And of course, I would only retain 20% of that information, and so I reread the text tutorials on terrain advantages, elemental status, alignment, unit weaknesses and strengths, yada yada yada. And at the end of it, I retained 40% of that knowledge, but only used 20% of it. The game is obviously not concerned about making you feel dumb or incompetent. I think back to my time with Pokemon Blue and how concerned the game was with teaching you basic rock, paper, scissors mechanics and the concept of a varied party right to the game's end. And it made that aspect of the gameplay so mundane. Ogrebattle, on the other hand, is so far afield of that. There's so much information that the game wants you to retain, but that begs the important question. Is all that information required reading? Do the systems reward you appropriately when you understand and utilize them? Unfortunately, I'm not an authority on the game. I went into it blind, no experience with the series, and I shunned online help, barring one unanswered question, and I spent 80 hours on what some call a 40-hour game, and still did not see the end. That being said, I did eventually uncover an effective way of dominating my opponents in that time, and it didn't require all that much use of these varied and numerous systems. So I may be left to think that maybe there's a lot of excess to be trimmed down. Now, you may be thinking I'm getting ahead of myself, as I have not even spoken about any of these systems in detail or any of the gameplay. But here's the rub on that. If I were to speak on all of these systems, it would be terrible. It would be like a poor transcription of the tutorials in the game. So for that reason, I am going to speak broadly about the gameplay systems, perhaps only go into detail about the most important aspects. But with that said, let's talk gameplay. We will go in a semi-linear fashion. For the main game, you find yourself on the overworld map, level select. Upon selecting a level, Hugo, your tactician, gives you a brief intelligence rundown on how the enemy is arrayed and what is the best course of action. You are then moved to the main level map screen, wherein you deploy your squads/battalions from your stronghold to begin your long march to claim your enemy's stronghold, as is the objective in every map. Your squads, though I think they're actually called units, but in my script I have them as squads, so that's what we're going with. Your squads move in real time via a go here cursor and engage automatically with enemies and other instances as they find them. Their basic pathfinding has them follow the curvatures of the roads, but they can be told to move over mountains or into forests if you tell them to do so. On that note, aside from rivers and bridge crossings, there really is no natural barriers on this map. The only thing the terrain affects, as far as I can comprehend, is how fast a unit moves and fatigues on a given terrain, with each squad having a terrain advantage determined by their composition. And all my squads, or 90% of them anyway, operated best on the plains. But that is not something I really ever delved into, as it was complicated, with seemingly little benefit. But what do I know? The point is, this ain't Fire Emblem, where the maps play big roles in the strategy and gameplay. Aside from cities to liberate or capture, which have their occasional goodies, the map layouts feel surprisingly secondary. Also, the level map is very ugly. Probably get into that later, but it's very ugly. Everything in the game, aside from some effects, is pre-rendered sprites and backgrounds, but the map is made up of basic geometry and textures, and it's so ugly. The treetops of the forests are a uniformly flat, muddled green texture, slightly raised above the ground. The water is this terrible blue texture with a basic rippling effect. And the mountains are crudely sculpted brown mounds. It is all just very bad looking as an asset, and it looks unfinished, both by itself and in comparison to all the other assets. Digression aside, the field of battle for Ogrebattle is not on the field itself, but in its unit formations. That's the meat of it. Serving as almost a combination between party RPG mechanics and that of strategy RPGs. You can have up to 10 5-man crews operating at once, though bigger units like dragons count as 2 units. How you arrange each squad and how they are equipped is what is paramount. Being given a 3x3 grid, it's best to put your heavy units in front with your supports in the back, as is tried and true. Not always that cut and dry, but 90% of the time, that is the answer. With melee units getting 2 attack opportunities in the front row, and magic users, healers, and archers getting the same in the back row. Of course, back row and front row is relative, as one of the core basic tactics of Ogrebattle is outflanking your... And my script messed up. As one of the core basic tactics of Ogrebattle is outflanking your opponent, or catching them in a pincer movement, in which case their supports may be occupying the front row and their melees are in the back. One way in which the strategy of pincer movements is maximized is the knockback mechanic, which sees squads who have lost an engagement being flung back a few steps on the map screen. And if that squadron were to be flung back onto an opposing squad, positioned accordingly, they would be forced to engage with an out-of-sorts formation. Of course, it is important to have your squad in the rear at the proper distance, as I have had the defeated enemy squad pushed through and past my squad, whereupon I was outflanked. I would say this is one of the more unique and cool dynamics that Ogrebattle has over other strategy RPGs like Fire Emblem, as not only is it just plain fun to cripple a tougher squad by a strike from behind, there's also great mechanical implications to it, both for and against the player. There was one mission where my leader's squad got pushed out of my advancing column and ended up being completely encircled without immediate aid, as he just kept getting engaged to the point that I believe he, that is my protagonist, died. And I gamed over, naturally. In other instances, I split up my squads into two separate columns and placed them on divergent paths for the express purpose that they would converge on the enemy's main force on two different fronts. Of course, there are units that operate effectively both in the back row and the front row, and also in the unloved middle row. The Valkyries, for instance, are expressly stated in the manual as being outflankable if one is placed on every corner of the formation grid. Then there's the Paladins, which, while in the front are effective melee fighters, when in the back row, they act as healers when equipped with their default blessed sword. So on that note, it's definitely important to experiment with, or at least look into, how units will operate per the different placements. There's more considerations yet regarding the units and the formations, regarding terrain advantages, elemental status, alignment, equipment, battle strategies and fatigue, and capturing a city versus liberating it, etc., etc. And as I previously mentioned, I cannot speak on all of it. But to touch on battle strategies. First, I will mention that battles play out automatically with unit stats determining the order of attack, which happens on an individual basis rather than by group, I think. But there are 4 optional combat behaviors that you select for your squads prior to and during battle, which are as follows: autonomous, attack leader, attack weakest, attack strongest, and attack leader. If you want to rout the enemy, you attack the leader, where upon their death, the remnants of that squad will be in active flight and will present no risk on the level map, unless actively pursued or stumbled upon by accident. To launch into a small history lesson, this was the way that the Spartans were defeated, primarily by the Thebans, who knew that the Spartans had their principal fighters and society leaders on the right side, as it was the place of honor. So they, the Thebans, deployed either a left-wheeling echelon/staircase formation to engage the Spartan right first, and it would crush it long before the other sides even came to blows, if they did at all, as the defeat of the Spartan right often, if not always, led to the Spartan left routing. So there's your history minute. As for the other three strategies, their implications are fairly self-explanatory, though regardless of which strategy you pick, it will not completely override your individual unit's predispositions. For instance, if a unit was anywhere in the right column, your units placed on the inverse right column are not going to attack them until the units just opposite or adjacent to them are dead. Though units in the middle column are always in reach to attack or be attacked. So if your aim was to kill a certain unit, make sure to stack the column opposite them prior to that engagement, which can be done at any time on the level map screen. So that is how fighting transpires in Ogrebattle. There are other factors to go into as well, such as resurrecting fallen units at witches' dens and the different items you can carry, but there is no time for that. But I will make time to touch on the fatigue meter, which is the flag icon on the bottom UI bar. The more you travel and where you travel, my darn script. The more you travel, and depending where you travel, that makes that icon fill up. And the higher the fatigue, the more your units miss or are blocked, with the same fatigue rules applying to the enemy. You can lower the meter with items or by making camp, lest your men be forced to make camp by fatigue and are happened upon by your enemies as they sleep. So that's the fatigue meter. Anyway, going beyond battles, the remainder of one's time will be spent in the organization screen, which is heaven for micromanagers, as there you equip and upgrade one unit at a time with one action at a time. As an action, I would say it is similar to putting Lego figurines together. That act of sliding clothing or armor onto their torso, setting hair pieces or helmets onto their head, clasping weapons or objects into their hands. That is the feeling I get with Ogrebattle's organization screen. And even as I enjoy it for that, I feel at the same time the amount of time spent there is a bit much. On average, I would be on the organization screen for maybe 45 minutes between missions, or at least close to. One of the biggest time sinks is equipping your units, as not only are there at least a dozen different classes of units, many of these classes do not share the same armors or weapons, and so for me, I would go to equip a specific unit with newly acquired armor and was unable to find it in the scrolling equipment menu for that unit. And so I would have to go to a different unit to see if that item was available for them. And eventually, I could guess what armor was for light infantry and what was for heavier infantry. But what I could not figure out is why some units got damage and defense boost from certain weapons and armor, while others in the very same class did not have such boosts bestowed to them. So the method I was left with was to check every individual to ensure they were getting, or rather, they were being optimized before each battle. And while I'm holding this whiny tone, I do have some real complaints about the organization screen, such as how convoluted it is to change the class of your squad leaders, as in order to change or upgrade them, you have to transfer leadership over to another member of that squad. That is, if there is another member eligible. That is, if there is another member eligible. If there isn't, you have to switch out units to acquire that leader's replacement, and then switch them out again. And after all this faffing about to get to the class upgrade menu, you discover that your leader couldn't upgrade classes anyway, and it was all a waste of time. Another issue with the organization menu is that some actions, which should be together, are not. For instance, carrying items and using items are in separate categories, with one of them being in a category that does not make sense. Overall, though, moving from individual quibbles, my big question concerning the UIs and menus in the organization screen is, are they bad or just different? In most games, if you want to go to character options, you select the character, and then a pop-up window appears with all the options. And then you pick the one you want, and a different menu comes up, and it continues as such until you have the option you want. In Ogrebattle 64, you do not select the character you wish to act upon until you have singled out the action, which threw me off. But again, I do not know if it is innately worse or just different from the standard system. Regardless of what the answer is, there are problems with the organization screen, such as those mentioned above. Oh, so much to talk about again, winded. There is a lot more I could talk about, but there's only one more thing I really want to delve into, that being the question I asked towards the beginning. That being, how practical or important are all these systems and extra considerations? Do they make for a more enriching experience than can be found in other games that don't have them? To some degree, certainly. Just on account of the joy of discovery that you get with Ogrebattle 64. For example, discovering that my dead unit, who I failed to resurrect, turned into a zombie that could regen when killed henceforth. That was cool, as was finding a wild pumpkin head when traipsing around the map, or seeing my first enemy legion. There was negative surprises as well, such as my first encounter with a cockatrice, essentially an oversized chicken that petrifies my soldiers, and the only way to unpetrify them was an expensive item. Otherwise, they would remain as stone even after the level was beaten. Always something new around the corner, I suppose, especially in terms of units. So many drastically different classes being introduced. There must be 30 or more different unit classes in this game, with almost as many different beast units, and all of them have multiple actions determined by both placement and squad composition. meaning there is lots of little and not so little surprises to keep the core gameplay fresh, including lots of visual effects during battle for some gusto. That being said, though, going back to the myriad of systems in this game and whether or not they were necessary or well utilized, let me put it this way. I myself did not utilize half of these mechanics, which makes me a poor authority on the question. Even so, I was still consistently winning. However, just because I was winning does not mean I was winning well. People say that the average playthrough of Ogrebattle is 40 hours. While for me, I was 80 hours in and still 10 missions shy from finishing when I walked away. Now, I question whose average playthrough is being referred to, but that is not important. What is important, though, and what I am struggling to transition into, is the topic of getting good, using strategy and optimizing gameplay, which to ask the question, does the game even teach you how to play it effectively, or at least steer you in the right direction with teachable moments or teachable moments or extended scenarios? Or does it leave you to blindly infer what it was never implying? I'm not one to use walkthroughs or forums, at least not right away, as laying bare a game's secrets can dispel the magic of a game, and even ruin organic progression, and only for the cause of satiating one's impatience. But with Ogrebattle 64, if you, like me, are a series newcomer, maybe consulting a forum would be prudent, as Ogrebattle 64 does not teach you how to play in a way that is respectful of your time. For the first 70 hours of my playtime, I played Ogrebattle like it was a Fire Emblem game, fielding as many squads as possible and engaging every possible enemy squad to destroy them for experience points. Initially, my squads were predominantly offensive, but at some point in the game, around chapter 14 or 15, little more than a third way through the game, enemy squads started being comprised of healing pairs who could effectively erase any damage done to them or their comrades, unless you outflank them, putting them on the front row, in which case you might kill one of them if your attacks were savage enough. But other enemy squads will or were comprised of paladins and healers, or just all paladins, who are equipped with the Blessed Sword, which turns that unit into a healer if they are placed into the back row, meaning that they will have a back row of healers no matter what. And then all the other squads without healers were simply laden down with consumable healing items. It becomes trench warfare, or the equivalent of, with all these heal tanks. I remember once going after one squad for the better part of an hour, one crew, and I could not break them. It was ridiculous. As for my squads, they kept winning the exchanges on account of dealing more damage, but they kept all their nicks and bruises while the enemy was healing all of their gouges, and so I was losing units or burning consumables, too many consumables, with my present course. And so I took a note from my foes and converted all but 2 of my archers into healers, which was very successful. Basically removed all the danger in combat. The priest unit, for instance, has the ability to heal an entire column or row, including themselves, if they're in the row or column. That's, way overpowered, to the point that it is almost impossible to kill them if there's two in a squad. Even if you roll up on them from behind. In other squads, I had 2 lesser clerics in the back row to make them unkillable. I have heard someone call Ogrebattle 64 broken, and with how powerful the healers are, maybe so, but using them is a slow affair, and killing them even a slower one yet. I am not versed in all strategy RPGs, but I will go out on a limb and say the better ones keep a short supply of healing enemies, because it just makes longer fights rather than more interesting ones, especially in this game's case. There's no real strategy added, it's just longer. So, for the next 20 hours, I played the game in this slow push fashion, still clinging to that Fire Emblem notion that I needed to lap up every bit of XP to keep ahead. Though I was becoming ever aware that of my 10 crews, seven of them were getting it done, and the other 3 were simply not. Additionally, on one of my live streams, a viewer said that they succeeded in Ogrebattle 64's SNES predecessor by feeding all the XP into just 2 squads. I myself kept my squad number at 7, but the principle turned out to work the same for this game. Whether I was being surrounded and being closed in on, or the enemy was holding a position, it was a simple thing of breaking through with my stronger column and gunning it to the headquarters, while keeping one squad back near my base in case a pesky Hawkman squad was honing in on it. Once I moved from attacking enemies for XP to simply pushing them out of my way, the protracted engagements that I had previously, had previously plagued me became very rare, and the chapters were halved, if not thirded. And yes, thirded is a word. I had to look it up. This is as far as I got with my tactics before I stopped playing. As nice as the quicker pace was, it also feels flawed, as it is incredibly simplistic, and perhaps even broken, to use that word. One particular aspect that makes this strategy feel broken is the kill the leader strategy, which, as I have mentioned, makes the entire squad rout. And for 8 out of 10 enemy squads, they put their leader right in the center column, with no units to shield them, unless the leader is a support class. Even the boss at their headquarters is situated like such, so as to be easily dispatched. In my experience, my best squads could kill the leader and rout their squad in one engagement, making the breakthrough process as easy as plowing fresh snow. And while the column kept moving towards the goal, those in the back of it could break off and pursue the fleeing enemy for some XP while there was some time for it. As for those enemy units with lots of healers, you can ignore them, as their low damage output guarantees they will be repelled when encountered. However, if you encounter cockatrice squads, bad times are ahead. The important thing to do is just kill their leader and rout them. You're going to have a unit be petrified. Make sure you have petrification stones or whatever they're called. But yeah, kill their leader, rout that unit. It's not going to be a good time, but it's doable. Anyway, I am not sure if this is the game's primary way of being broken, but it is the best course of action that I found. And if the best course of action all along was to merely ignore most of my army and most of theirs, as well as ignoring most of the map, as it's not all that much in play unless liberating cities was super important, though I have seen no indication of that, then also ignoring most of the game's many systems. Don't know if that sentence made sense, but anyway, that if you can just ignore most of the game and most of its systems, that's a flawed meta and a flawed game. It is flawed because it inundates you with gameplay mechanics that are essentially red herrings, which ultimately just waste your time. It is flawed because there is no real challenge, and it is flawed because even though you are playing it wrong, you are still succeeding with minimal negative feedback provided. I feel a lot of RPGs, though, could have this problem, where the price of playing badly is inefficiency and not defeat, essentially leaving the player to their own bad devices. And unless you become so inured with the genre, the time you spend with an RPG will be suboptimal. To compare that to something like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, wherein when you beat a level, you are a master of it, because that level will not let you fail forward. Your play has to be optimal, and that ensures the experience is itself optimal for everyone who chooses to keep with it. I have spoken a lot. Let's have a quick little music break. We'll be right back, though. All right, we are back. So for all the statements I am making about Ogrebattle 64, after 80 hours of playing it, all of those statements are possibly mere conjecture. Maybe breaking through the line only works with over-leveled units. Not that mine were necessarily over-leveled. In fact, the enemies of higher classes than mine indicated that I was under-leveled. Regardless, maybe playing lean and mean requires the effective use of alignment and elemental properties and terrain advantages. Or maybe the game is a lot much more fun when these things are utilized. I do not have a freaking clue, because the game does not tell you which element bests the other, or that chaotic fighters fight better at night. At least they do in the NES or the SNES game. Or maybe they did tell you all of this somewhere in the 50 pages of written tutorials. But if that was the case, I would be absolved, as with so much information, key info must be stated emphatically. I'm not really sure. Perhaps before recording this, I will play the 10 hours again, the first 10 hours, That is, to see what statements hold water and what statements do not, and add an addendum accordingly, no doubt placed just below this paragraph. All right, so this is future me, and I did return to the game, started from scratch, played for another 13 hours to test my theories, and, well, let me just read through my original thoughts first, as it will be a fun time capsule. I tell you, this was one of the harder reviews to write, as after 81 hours with Ogrebattle 64, I am unable to speak on it definitively. All I can do is speak to my experience, and my experience was a lot of blind fumbling. Perhaps that was a self-inflicted blindness brought on by my own preconceptions about strategy RPGs. But then again, how is my instinct to keep as many of my units leveled up a bad one? Why wouldn't I plan for the eventual contingency of being overwhelmed by a larger and more powerful force? With most, if not all, RPGs, that is the possible, if not probable, eventuality that looms over players in the first half or so of that sort of game, acting as a caution against those who might otherwise be complacent in grinding for levels. Then again, maybe I was being too simple and singular-minded, putting too much focus on that, while failing to plan an efficient method of play. Speaking of Ogrebattle specifically, I doubt that, but it is possible. While these uncertainties might cloud my overall perceptions, nonetheless, I can say Ogrebattle's 64's core gameplay is satisfying, despite the fact that it might be exploitable to a fault. Also, Ogrebattle's cryptic nature provides intrigue and an air of mystery, despite the fact that it might fail to provide clear direction, and much of what you learn might not be terribly important. That is my summation of Ogrebattle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber. Of course, there are other aspects of games that I might normally spill lots of ink over, but in this case, I feel only a few words are required. Audiovisually, aside from the aforementioned 3D battle maps, the game looks pretty good and sounds pretty good. Its pre-rendered assets may not be a sharp rebuke to the N64's more polygonal offerings, but they look as good as they did back in 2000. As for the music, while there was no track that truly grabbed my attention, it all feels appropriately lofty for the game's high fantasy world. And the sound quality is decent for the N64. Unfortunately, Ogrebattle 64's audio visuals have a limited scope. For the 33 maps that I played, there was only 5 different music tracks, but only 2 of those tracks were predominantly used. There's also the battle theme and the town theme, as well as the final battle theme, and let us not forget the Witch's Den theme, all of which you will hear on every single battle map right through to the end of the game. The soundscape does not evolve in Ogrebattle 64. Neither do the visuals. You will see the same 5 pre-rendered backdrops again and again. The same farmhouse background, the same tavern, the same war council chamber. etc., etc. This limited scope makes the game feel smaller than it really is. As for the narrative, the plot and setting are pretty good, tackling lots of interesting geopolitical topics such as societal hierarchies, the societal destabilization caused by revolutions, and the power vacuum they create, justice versus retribution, or whether or not a doomed cause is worth following. And within these themes, the player is able to express their own beliefs regarding such matters through a series of choices they are given throughout the game's duration. All of this has serious consequences for the game's outcome. The problem with the story, however, is that the localization is pretty bad. The prose are too modern and even angsty sounding for the high fantasy setting. Phrases like shut up or shit or hell or who does this Joker think he is, crap like that. Which, not an uncommon phenomena in today's fantasy writing, which includes even the likes of God of War Ragnarok. But we are not talking about the death of fantasy prose by hack writers here. Just talking about Ogrebattle 64's bad writing. And getting back to that, for how interesting many of the themes could be, it's stifled by a cast of cartoonishly evil baddies like Baldwin and Raid, who are without subtlety. Taken together with the bad prose, it is all just a little too silly, making for a narrative that does its job providing both context and progression, but is not excellent in its own right by any means. I like Dio, though. He has a lot of bluster and aggression, but he is a straight arrow who has your back. That is all I have to say about that, and all I have to say about Ogrebattle 64. My opinion on the game is somewhat uncertain and could definitely change, but if I were to give it a score here and now, I would say 7.5 out of 10. As it's very good, or as it is a very good game, pardon me, replete with a strong identity, interesting gameplay, and a host of idiosyncratic mechanics at play. But I am disappointed that it is only very good, as initially I thought it might be excellent. A top echelon game in the N64 pantheon. But it does not live up to the grandeur that it was hinting at on the outset. Too weighed down with wonky writing, limited audio visuals, and gameplay that is too small and simple for the scale it takes place on. And like many N64 games, Ogrebattle overstayed its welcome, at least on a first playthrough. A second playthrough might certainly prove worthwhile, but probably only for those who have or had a limited library of games. For others, though, the game is already such a large time investment that 90% of them will just bounce off. But for myself, who made that investment, I wanted a better return. And that is one of the reasons I place no value on long games. Most of them are not worth that 30 plus hours that they require, and are definitely not worth any added time that can be had through second-rate secondary objectives. You and I are going to die one day, so fight your OCD urges and leave the Koroks under their rocks. Anyway, 7.5 out of 10 for Ogrebattle 64. Agree, disagree, throw it in the comments, or send me an email at nalistenerq@gmail.com. That is nalistenerq@gmail.com. We will go to rankings now after some music. Okay. Addendum time. My 81 hours of gameplay is now 94 hours of gameplay. I started from the beginning with the mindset of punching through with minimal grinding, and I got through the first section with relative ease. So my prevailing theories continue to prevail. I had some units die and other units refuse to join because certain conditions failed to be met. But none of those setbacks were holding me back, and any concerns that my units are too squishy was quelled, or were too squishy rather, were quelled by the addition of a cleric to them. Unfortunately, despite these easily gained wins, it still feels like each map takes an hour. And yes, I do leave animations on because I like animations. It's kind of my fault, but if I turn animations off, it becomes even more boring. Anyway, Chapter 8 took 2 hours, but I failed Chapter 8. Though for bogus reasons, I'll say. Regardless, the winning strategies are as simplistic as I feared. Also of note, the dialogue is a lot more painful the second time around. Quite embarrassing, really, and not easily skimmed through. So long as I am not forced to be subjected to it, I do not fault games for their bad storytelling, but I felt subjected to this. Overall, I did not have a particularly good time with this game on restart. Now, one could chalk that up to fatigue, but I am fairly certain that after unraveling this mysterious game for nearly 100 hours, it turns out that there is less substance here than I hoped. Too simple and slightly repetitive even. Which is a shame because I am convinced that the concept has a lot more to offer than was offered. So I will be amending the score to 7 out of 10. Still a good game, but not a very good one. With that addendum and amendment out of the way, let us see how well Ogrebattle does battle with the rest of these N64 games. Having received 7 out of 10, we'll compare it to its peers of that same score. Is Ogrebattle better than GoldenEye? I don't know. I feel like GoldenEye is more fun at the moment, but I would say with the onboarding process and how exciting that is, learning all this stuff with all the stuff about Ogrebattle, even though a lot of it turns out to be pointless, I'll say I think Ogrebattle 64 is better than GoldenEye. I know GoldenEye has the multiplayer component to keep it fresh for a long time, whereas Ogrebattle, I don't know, just seems like Ogrebattle is destined to get worse. crap, I'm really talking myself out of my decision here. Ogrebattle is just a more well-built game. The multiplayer in GoldenEye is well enough, and you can really jingle around with the settings to make it even better, but the single player has some pretty silly flaws and some outright terrible levels. Some really good levels too, but GoldenEye is a very flawed experience in my opinion. Where Ogrebattle, it's flawed, but it's not flawed in that kind of way. It's not inconsistent in the experience. So I'd say Ogrebattle 64 is better than GoldenEye. Is Ogrebattle 64 better, than Sin and Punishment? I would say it is, because Sin and Punishment, given the controls or the controller interface on the N64, it doesn't. That controller really doesn't benefit that sort of game. Like the analog stick would be very sluggish when it came to moving that reticle around. Also, Sin and Punishment, it's pretty good, but mostly it's the controller. The game is too ambitious for that controller. And you know, there are some really good levels in Sin and Punishment, but there's also a lot of real janky visuals, and I don't know. Really, it's really a tight race with all of these N64 games at 7 out of 10. They're all pretty close to one another. In fact, I'm starting to think maybe I should move Sin and Punishment down below GoldenEye. Well, nah, I don't know. Anyway, Ogrebattle, I think it's a better game than Sin and Punishment, because while the strategy is perhaps slightly too simplistic, there are a lot of mechanics in play, and it is a big, grand adventure with lots of customization and organization and tension, for some tension anyway, as opposed to Sin and Punishment's imperfect controls and kind of hard to look at graphics. Not in every instance, but in many instances, Sin and Punishment's pretty hard to look at. Alright. So, yeah, Ogrebattle is better than Sin and Punishment. Is Ogrebattle 64 better than Mario Tennis? Mario Tennis is a very ugly N64 game that's kind of anemic in terms of content, but there is enough there that you can have fun with your friends. It's a good enough party game. And just fighting the AI in tournament mode is fun enough. And by fun enough, I mean heart attack inducing, because the game's very hard. Honestly, like, I had preemptively placed Ogrebattle 64 above Mario Tennis, and now I'm just not really feeling that. Honestly, a lot of these games that Ogrebattle has to go up against next, a lot of their fun comes from playing them in multiplayer, which keeps their novelty going long past when you're done with them. You can always return to them with a friend, potentially, and you'd be having a good time. With Ogrebattle 64, as I've kind of gone through it in the review, Sorry, I'm stumbling my words. Still sober, but you know, I stumble my words even when I'm sober. Ogrebattle's novelty seems to be draining as you play it for a long time. And I did play the game for 90 hours. But I also played Mario Tennis for like 20, 25 hours, so gosh. I don't really know. I kind of had Ogrebattle preemptively placed above some of these games because it's a big, grandiose experience. And the rearranging your formations is a fun part of the game, and equipping and all that stuff, all that organization is fun, but oh boy. I think that Mario Tennis as a game, while I don't like looking at it, it's got some really phenomenally solid gameplay that doesn't really hold your hand. It just makes you get good at that game. And you can also play it with a friend and create rivalries in that sense. So, Ogrebattle 64, yeah, I don't think it's better than Mario Tennis. So we're gonna move it. We're gonna move it around. Yeah, Ogrebattle is going right underneath Mario Kart or Mario Tennis. And that's where it will stay. And I read off the list last week, so I'm not going to do it this week. But just know that Ogrebattle scored 7 out of 10, and it is nestled between Mario Tennis and Sin and Punishment. Well, actually, it's nestled between... No, that's where it is. I was thinking of pushing Sin and Punishment below GoldenEye and switching them around now that I thought about it more. But no, I'm not going to do that. Sin and Punishment has some control issues, but it doesn't have some like innate level design flaws that GoldenEye has. So yeah, that is how Ogrebattle 64 will rank. And with that, we are going to conclude the show there. To those who listened, thanks for listening. And if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching there. Regardless, however you consumed this content, thank you and have a God bless day. Because we are out.